Thank you both so much for joining us today. We're going to talk about the criminal justice reform bill. It's gone through the House, it's gone through the Senate, and let's kind of talk about where it is now and where it's going. So Julian, you want to start?
Thank you, Sarah. It's glad to be with you.
Thank you.
And glad to have my colleague, Senator Will Brownsberger, who in the Senate is the chair of our Judiciary Committee, and has really been the lead thinker in the body in looking at criminal justice reform, a whole host of issues in criminal justice reform. This is something that the Senate and the House have been working on for quite some time, but really I think in the past year having a really deliberative process in trying to come up with a balanced approach around how do you make sure that we're doing the best we can by folks who are involved in our criminal justice system, both across that.
So the people working in it and the people that are affected by it.
Of course, which is many folks. But really glad to have Will Brownsberger here today, who's been the lead on this. This is an effort that has been bipartisan, in the Senate, especially in the House, a strong effort. But we'll turn it over to my colleague, Senator Brownsberger, to describe the process that we took to get here.
Wonderful.
Well, it's really been something that's been going on for a long time, many years, really. There's been a deep conversation about the need for criminal justice reform, the need to lift people up instead of locking them up, the need to, when people have made mistakes and gotten involved in the system, we need to cut the chains that hold them down when they're trying to get back up on their feet. And at the same time, we need to keep in mind the needs of victims and the concern for public safety. And so that's a deep conversation. We've been having it for a number of years. We've been having it more intensely really over the last 2 or 3 years. We've had a very public process that with the Council of State Governments consulting, and then we've gone through a lot of hearings and developed a package of measures that I think are really on the cusp of getting done now. As you said, the House has done it, the Senate's done it, and we are about to embark on that conference process of reconciling the differences. I think we've got bills that are not too far apart that kind of at least talk about the same things. And I'm very hopeful that we'll work through the differences and get something across the governor's desk sometime early next year.
That's wonderful. I know I've been talking to our state representatives about this for the past couple of months, so it's nice to see that everybody's working together to get this bill moved forward. I think it's great to see that the state is taking that, because I know it's a nationwide conversation, criminal justice reform, so I know that it's really important. I know one of the aspects of it that you guys have been working on is the mandatory minimums. Would you like to address that a little bit, and where we are with that and how that's looking as a piece of it?
Sure. Mandatory minimums is actually one of those things that people focus on most, as you say. It's sort of the top of most people's list, both from both sides of the equation, from both sides of the conversation. I actually think of it as just one of a number of things we do in this bill that are all important. What we do in this bill is we look at the drug business as kind of on 3 levels. You've got like any other business, you've got your customers. We call them users, usually when we talk about drugs. You've got your retailers, your storefronts. I think we talk about dealers when we talk about drugs. And then we've got your wholesalers, your traffickers. In this bill, we actually strengthen the mandatory minimum penalties for trafficking, and we address the issue of fentanyl. We don't have it on our books today, any mandatory minimum for fentanyl, which is really kind of taking the place of heroin in a lot of the markets of the state. Acts a lot like heroin, but it's even more potent, and there's flavors of fentanyl that are even more potent still, carfentanil. And so we don't have mandatory minimums in place for those. We're going to treat those just the same way we treat heroin once we pass this bill, which is, in fact, we have very significant mandatory minimums for that, for trafficking in those drugs. Where we back off is for the retailers, the lower level person, seller, not the one who's just selling directly to the user, very likely to be a user themselves, or in any case, a kid with an issue that needs to be turned in a different direction, who's not gone too far into the business. And so that's where we back off on mandatory minimums in this bill.
I think the opiate epidemic really has reframed how a lot of us, certainly in the legislature, also those in law enforcement, judges as well, really look at, what's the best way to really address drug abuse and folks who are participating in those systems. I think of, and I've been really made an effort to sit down with chiefs of police across Cape Cod, and one quote that really stuck with me was from the deputy chief here in Barnstable, is that, we can't lock our way out of this problem when it comes to the opioid epidemic. And so I think part of criminal justice reform has been a real reframing in how do we think about that? How do you work to make sure that more people get into treatment? And then a whole host of other issues. I think one thing that I know Senator Brownsberger has worked really carefully on is looking at bail reform. And how do we make sure that folks are just not being held because they can't scrounge together those resources.
Right.
On the other hand, if someone who is actually a real danger to either themselves or to someone else, then we should have processes to make sure that those folks are held.
Right.
So just one of a myriad of sort of issues that are there. But I think really the opioid epidemic, and here we remain having some of the highest rates of opiate overdose, both leading to death and reversal right here in Barnstable County.
It's a real issue across the state, but like you said, definitely here in Barnstable County. So the next part is going to be reconciling the two versions between the House and the Senate before you bring it to the Senator. And you said that they're pretty close, and you're looking for January to maybe get it to the governor.
I think I said early next year.
Oh, early next year. Sorry.
I was a little bit softer than that.
Yeah.
I definitely would love it to be January.
Yeah.
And the good thing is, I think those of us who are involved have the appetite and the availability to really work through the holidays, and we'll really get started next week.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful. But that's it. There's a lot of details in this that we just really need to work through carefully.
Yeah.
It's not. It's partly about reconciling the differences and okay, you did this, we did that. Let's do something in between.
Right.
But it's also about just making sure that we get it right. That what we put on paper ultimately and put in the books is something that's going to work. It doesn't have unintended consequences.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all your hard work. I know this is a huge undertaking. It's something that I know hasn't been really looked at in a really long time, and I know how important it is. I know how important it is here to the residents of Barnstable and the residents of Cape Cod. So I appreciate both of your hard work on this, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us in, Sarah.
Thank you. My guests today are Senator Julian Cyr of Cape Cod and Will Brownsberger of Belmont.